Thank you. Good morning and welcome back. I hope you were here last night to see Al Franken. I'm John Podesta. I'm the president of the Center for American Progress. I'll be moderating the panel this morning. I want to thank you all for coming on behalf of the American Constitution Society for another great day. I'd like to welcome this morning's plenary panel on regulation in the age of Obama. And extend a special thanks to our panelists for agreeing to take the time to be here this morning. I've got three quick announcements, and then I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, and I'm going to start throwing questions out to our panelists. But first, this panel has been approved for CLE credit. In order to get CLE credit, you have to sign up at the CLE table if you want it, which I think is back in that area of the room, so do so if you need to. With respect to questions and answers, I'm going to take the prerogative of keeping the panel going for a little bit, but we want to get your questions as well. In order to do that, please write your questions on cards. If you don't have them, people wander through the crowd and give them to you, and then people will pick them up and provide them to me, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. And then for those of you who don't already know it, please turn off your cell phones or at least put them on buzz. We've turned ours off so that they don't interfere with the microphone. So again, it's a pleasure to be here. I don't know whether there's been a better time in recent or even not so recent memory to have this conversation. After 8 years of philosophy that sort of discounted the ability to regulate and largely eschewed the ability to exercise regulatory oversight, the chickens are perhaps the better metaphor these days as the oil-soaked pelicans have come home to roost. In today's news cycle, the most prominent symbol of regulatory failure is one that allowed a broken 19-inch pipe located a mile underwater to spew millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. The scope of this spectacular failure in environmental terms, I think, parallels the scope of the financial crisis in economic ones. When excessive risk-taking culminated in a wealth of toxic assets, the breakdown in the financial industry fanned out to poison not just the broader American economy, but the global economy as well. So this is one side of the regulatory coin that I'm sure we'll talk about today. In the aftermath of the two cataclysmic events, one environmental, one economic, what will it take to restore integrity to a regulatory process that has been shredded as a result of years of neglect? And I think a secondary question should be, is our goal to guarantee that these types of catastrophes will never again occur, or simply to try to minimize the risk that they will occur? I'm going to call this playing defense. On the other side of the coin is the affirmative use of regulation to push a progressive agenda, which has been, I think, a major role in the Obama administration's agenda. I'll call that playing offense. I think we'll hear a lot about that actually this summer during the Supreme Court confirmation hearing, since Solicitor General Kagan has written extensively about the affirmative use of regulation to move forward a vision through executive authority. But let me give you just a couple of illustrative examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. For example, the administration moved aggressively in the first weeks in office to put in place what later were finalized as the first ever fuel economy and greenhouse gas tailpipe emission standards that'll save 1.8 billion barrels of oil over the life of the program. The president recently announced that he's going to extend that program both in terms of vehicle years for cars and light-duty trucks, as well as for heavy-duty trucks, a first in our history. And he's doing similar things on the appliance efficiency side, on everything from microwaves to light bulbs. In the healthcare world, even as General Cordray's colleagues are suing to declare the new healthcare law unconstitutional, the administration's moving rapidly to issue rules governing everything from young adult coverage to small business tax credits to changes in Part D that covers the so-called donut hole for prescription drug coverage, access to high-risk pools, et cetera, et cetera. Those regulations are being developed and being put into place even as we sit here this morning. So in both these types of cases, in the defense and in the offense, it's not only design but effective implementation and compliance measures that are key to maintaining appropriate regulatory balance across the spectrum of issues at hand. We're fortunate to have five very sharp minds with us to talk about the range of issues on the table today. I'm going to make very brief introductions. I think you have longer bios in your packets. I'm going to start to my left. Tino Cuellar, who currently serves as Special Assistant to the President for Justice and Regulatory Policy on the Domestic Policy Council. Tino is currently on leave from Stanford Law, where his work is focused on subjects ranging from how organizations cope with the legal responsibility for managing complex regulatory problems to the role of criminal enforcement and risk regulation. Before joining the Stanford Law faculty, he served several years as senior advisor to the U.S. Treasury Department's Undersecretary for Enforcement, where he worked on countering domestic and international financial crime, improving border coordination, improving anti-corruption measures. He served as the co-chair of the Obama-Biden Transition Project on immigration policy, where we had the pleasure of working together. To his left, Judge Richard Posner has served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit since 1981 and was the chief judge from 1993 to 2000. He's been on the faculty of the University of Chicago Law School for over 40 years. He's one of the preeminent intellectual leaders in the application of economic methods and analysis to legal matters. Judge Posner was a founding editor of both the Journal of Legal Studies and the American Law and Economics Review. He also defines the word prolific, having written nearly 40 books and countless articles over the course of his career, even as he's on the bench, on the legal and ethical dimensions of a wide range of subjects and contemporary events, including 2 recent books on the financial and economic crisis. He's also taken on a new hat in recent years as a blogger with his Chicago colleague, Gary Becker. Lois Schiffer is the general counsel for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. She served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where she taught environmental law for more than 15 years. From 1993 to 2001, Lois was the Assistant Attorney General for Environment and Natural Resources Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. In that capacity, she argued cases related to environment and wildlife issues on behalf of the federal government. She was also a partner at Bosch, Robinson and Lewis, Senior Vice President for Public Policy at the National Audubon Society, and attorney with the Women's Rights Project of the Center for Law and Social Policy. Damon Silvers, sitting a bit further, is an Associate General Counsel for the AFL-CIO, where he has led a legal team that won severance payments for former Enron and WorldCom employees. His work focuses on areas of corporate accountability and regulation through the judiciary. Damon's been an extremely active member on the Congressional Oversight Panel, which was set up in the TARP legislation to review financial regulatory reform implementation. He served as the chair on the Competition Subcommittee of the United States Treasury Department's Advisory Committee on the Auditing Profession. He's also a member of the Treasury Department's Investor Practice Committee. Richard Cordray has served as the Attorney General of Ohio since 2008. His legal career includes work on areas of regulation, including household credit services and permits related to public use of government-owned land. Before serving as the Attorney General of Ohio, Richard was the Ohio State Treasurer, a member of the Ohio House of Representatives, and the first Ohio State Solicitor, where he was responsible for preparing cases to argue on behalf of the state of Ohio in both state and federal court. After attending law school, where he was the editor-in-chief of the University of Chicago Law Review, and I believe one of Judge Posner's students, Richard clerked for Justice Kennedy. Richard is also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. So we're probably going to defer all questions to you, General. Again, please thank all the panelists for joining us today. And I'm going to start off by taking the title of this panel seriously, Regulation in the Age of Obama, and I'd actually like to start with you, Richard. You've served in the age of Bush and in the age of Obama. You were state treasurer during President Bush's tenure. Do you see a major difference between the approach of this administration and the approach of the past administration in terms of regulatory policy, not just social policy and spending, but in terms of regulatory policy.
Well, from my corner of the world, which focuses over the last few years, especially in financial and legal matters, not a lot of the broader regulatory authorities that people may want to talk about today, there has been an enormous change between the two administrations. By the end of the Bush administration, there seemed to be an aggressive desire to oust the states from cooperating or fulfilling their responsibility in various areas to a preferred regime of no regulation in so many areas. Active preemption where nothing was being done by the federal authorities, but the states were being blocked from acting. And we saw some of that at the state level too, state legislature doing that to local authorities as well. The difference, was exemplified in the executive order on preemption that the administration issued in May of last year, but it's shown up also in the legislative fights over some of the significant legislation pending, including financial regulation, where there seems to be a recognition that even in areas where federal standards may be preferred or even optimal, there should very often be a presumption of joint enforcement by state and federal authorities. So it has been a dramatic change.
Let me come back to the other side. Tino, you cover regulatory policy at the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. That's sometimes, I think, thought of as the domain of Judge Posner's former colleague, Cass Sunstein at OMB in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, rather than an activity that really is focused in the West Wing. I do think the administration is characterized by a West Wing-centric focus. So perhaps it's makes sense that you focus on this as part of your duties. But apart from some of the individual regulations that I've mentioned, what's been the President's priority with respect to changing the policy that guides agency regulatory development? Richard already mentioned one, which is the change of the view of the way states work. Where have you placed the emphasis? Where's the President placed the emphasis in terms of change of policy?
Thank you for the question, and I'm very honored to be here. Before I answer the question, I do want to make one observation about the title of the panel, and that is, when I first saw the title, I must admit that I mistakenly read it as Regulating the Age of Obama. And when I saw that, it struck me that maybe I was a strict constructionist, but I thought the question was fairly well answered by the Constitution. So then I realized, of course, that we're not talking about that. So to answer your question, I think that it's worth beginning the conversation on this by asking ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about regulation? And particularly in a democracy of hundreds of millions of people where the scientific issues are extraordinarily complex, that's a difficult question sometimes to get across the answer to. I would say that when we talk about regulation, we're talking about simple, fair, and practical rules that protect persons and the environment. That's all we're talking about. People might have disagreements about exactly how these should be executed, what the priorities ought to be, but we should have no doubt that this is an extraordinarily important issue for the American public. And as the Obama administration has approached this, it's worth contrasting what I think is a more faithful narrative to what we've been trying to do with some of the descriptions that people might offer about an Obama approach to rulemaking and to regulations. You might hear that regulations at the end of the day are a partisan issue, that Democrats tend to like more costly regulations, or Republicans like less costly regulations and less regulation in general. I would be skeptical about that approach for several reasons. Number one, if you actually look at the net benefits of the regulations we've tried to undertake in this administration, whether they are about tobacco or about fuel efficiency or about truck drivers texting or not texting when they're driving, what you see is that the net benefit of these regulations actually exceeds the net benefits for regulations in the comparable time during the Clinton administration or during the George W. Bush administration. Second, you might hear the narrative that, in fact, this is an administration very focused on what's been referred to as behavioral economics. The idea that we ought to care about how real people react to regulatory rules. I certainly think it's important to focus on the actual reactions of people in the real world, but I don't think this is something that the Obama administration owns. You might look here in the district, for example, and see how a very tiny change in what happens when you check out from a store requiring you to pay 5 cents for the bag that you might then get, has led to a massive change in how many of these bags are actually placed into our environment and sometimes end up in the Anacostia River. Simply a reminder to people that their actions, taking a bag from a store, has an impact on the environment. I think a better description of what we've been trying to achieve, and I'll end with this for now, is we've been trying to refocus the work of government on rules that are simple, fair, and practical. Simple is important, first of all. What we're trying to achieve with financial regulatory reform is giving the public simple information about the financial products that they might be offered. That changes the way people think about things, and it changes their decision-making without necessarily having a heavy-handed approach and actually limiting people's choices. Fair and practical. Think about what's happening on tobacco. The goal that we have is very simple. It's to follow a statute that is trying to protect children from tobacco companies that are trying to get them addicted to tobacco. And what that means is establishing rules that create the right amount of responsibility among the private sector. Practical. Thinking about reasonable costs. This is why we're trying to look at what the impact is on the economy, particularly at a time when the economy is in such a tricky and challenging place. So in the end, I would say that all of this is important, but it's also important to think about the capacity of agencies to undertake and enforce these rules effectively. So we've also, and we can talk about this, been trying to make sure agencies have the right resources and making sure that where there are problems, as there have been, for example, with the Minerals Management Service, we try to work hard to make those agencies accountable and make them work better for the public.
I want to come back to you later, Tino, and talk about why there hasn't been more structural change in the way regulations are developed. But your formulation of simple, fair, and practical prompts me to ask Judge Posner. You've written a lot about complexity, the inability to really understand long-term risks, the incapacity of decision makers to really anticipate those long-term risks. What do you think about the simple, fair, and practical formulation? Is that really a guide post for how one implements regulation?
No, I don't think it works. No, I think if you look back, you have the deregulation. Oh,
I think you were going to say good luck.
good luck. Yes, good luck for simple regulation. What the lessons I drew? We have these two recent catastrophes: the economic catastrophe and now the oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico. So what do we learn from those? I think we learn four things. The first thing we learn is that the dream of very conservative economists that the economy could basically be regulated simply by competition backed up by antitrust law. That would protect consumers, producers, and so forth. And that was wrong. It was never very credible. But it had support. It had support. It had actually bipartisan support. And it neglected externalities. And the obvious externality, of course, is pollution. That's what we see in the Gulf of Mexico. The subtler externality was financial. It was not adequately recognized that if the banking industry is not effectively regulated, it can collapse, and when it collapses, it can bring down the entire economy. So that there's an externality. It's subtler than pollution, but it's just as serious, because all the business models are based on access to credit. People's personal consumption decisions are based on access to credit. If credit freezes because the banking industry is insolvent, the whole economy goes into a downward spiral. So we need regulation. But if we go back, we find that because regulation was a bad failure in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So beginning in the late 70s, we had a thoroughly bipartisan deregulation movement. It started in the Carter administration. The first banking deregulation law was enacted in 1980. And it continued a deregulation of the financial industry right through the Reagan administration, the first Bush administration, the Clinton administration. Actually, by the time of the second Bush administration, the deregulation of the financial industry was essentially complete. But what we had in the second Bush administration was regulatory inattention being added to deregulation. See, there are still obviously regulatory powers, but they were not being enforced. And in part because of this, this kind of faith in the market as self-regulating. Well, so that's the first lesson, that the capitalist system obviously requires a good deal of regulation. But the second sad lesson is that regulation works very badly. And again, it's a bipartisan failure. I mean, unquestionably, it was made worse by Bush appointments, no question about it. But it is bipartisan. Remember, Greenspan was reappointed by Clinton. So what we saw, what we see in the Gulf with the Minerals Management Service is that a great deal of regulation occurs so low down in the government that there's no effective oversight of it, and it becomes easily captured by the regulated agencies. We also see, of course, that because the society is becoming technologically more complex, regulation is more challenging than it's ever been, because it's very difficult for government agencies to hire people with cutting-edge technological abilities. That's true for deep sea oil drilling, but it's also true for financial regulation because of the enormous increase in complexity of financial products and methods. What's particularly shocking in terms of evaluating the potential of regulation is that the Federal Reserve and the Securities and Exchange Commission were traditionally two of the most respected federal regulatory agencies. They screwed up incredibly with respect to the financial industry, and I think are largely responsible for the disaster. And again, a bipartisan failure. As I say, you go back to the 90s with the fight that Larry Summers, the Secretary of Treasury, got into with Brooks Lee Bourne, the chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. There was very, very strong desire to allow the financial industry to evolve with very minimal regulation. These agencies, the Federal Reserve and the SEC, had very adequate powers to have headed off the financial collapse that crested in 2008. Instead, they were largely responsible, I think, for the crisis. The Federal Reserve, because in the early 2000s, it pushed short-term interest rates down to unprecedented levels, negative in real terms for several years. It set off a housing bubble, and later, of course, the crash. And to that bubble, the Federal Reserve was completely oblivious. And then it turns out, we learn, that much of the modern banking industry actually consists of non-banks, like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and the ill-fated Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and so on. These companies engage in banking-type operations, but they do not have insured deposits. They're extremely risky. They're regulated by the SEC. The SEC was wholly oblivious to the risks that these companies were taking. This means, incidentally, if I'm right in my diagnosis of the causes of the financial crisis, that it's silly to criticize the bankers as the sort of populist explanation for the crisis. Bankers are stupid, reckless, greedy, because, capitalism is Darwinian. The businesses will maximize profits within whatever framework the government creates. If they don't maximize profits, they die. They lose their investors and they lose their best employees. So if the regulatory system allows them, and this is true with the oil drilling as well as with the finance, if it allows them to take a tremendous number of risks, they will, because risk and profit is usually correlated, and especially if they're small annual risks, right? 1% risk of a catastrophe is actually a big risk. But all of us have limited horizons. If you have a 1% annual risk of disaster, that's like a 10% risk of a disaster in the next 10 years, and that may be your horizon, so you don't worry about it. So, the companies will do what we allow them to do. The other So, and with financial regulation, as with regulation of deep oil drilling, it's so complicated, it's just extremely difficult to hire people to work in the government and have the kind of sophistication that the private sector people with their much more generous salaries provide. We've also learned, depressingly, that, well, we know that there are limits in petroleum engineers' understanding of this of this leak. But we also know that economists have failed to achieve a good understanding of the economy as a whole, of the business cycle, and the interrelation between finance and the rest of the economy. There's even been sort of regression since 1936, Keynes' publication of the General Theory of Employment, interest in money. We don't seem to have as good an understanding as he did of the macroeconomy. So that's disappointing. And the last point I'll make in this depressing litany
Cheer us up
is
at the
that
end here, Judge.
the European model of regulated capitalism doesn't work any better than ours, probably works worse. And what's strange about that is that, of course, regulation, the European countries are more welcoming to regulation, and in particular, they have a more prestigious civil service and better paid and so on than America. But their system doesn't work. Because if you look at how first of all, they were as blindsided by the financial collapse as our bank regulators were. They had no advantage. And now they're crawling out of their version of our depression or recession, whatever you want to call it. They're growing out of it even more slowly than we are. And they, of course, have this terrible problem of lack of economic unity in Europe, and they're struggling at least as badly as we are, and probably worse. So I'm not optimistic about regulation. It would be nice if you could have simple rules and so on, but the complexity of the regulated activities is such that I don't think simplicity is feasible. So I think we'll just be muddling through, have a lot of disappointments. It's certainly wrong to be blaming the administration or the president for not being able to plug the hole in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. That's ridiculous, but Americans very demanding, want to have solutions, unforgiving, and then it leads to the politicians denouncing the business people for being greedy and so on, which is fine, but it does not provide a solution.
Damon, I want to let you react to that. You've been underwhelmed by the pace of change, I would say. Maybe that doesn't fairly characterize your position, but it seems to me that when I look at your public statements, you're underwhelmed by the pace of change, particularly in the financial regulatory arena. Is there a big difference between Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, between George Bush in 2008 and Barack Obama in 2009 and 2010? Damon?
Oh,
Well,
I'm sorry.
Thank you, John. First,
He's okay.
it's
I think your mic's not working.
they've got me mic'd here, I think. First, I think there are a number of law students in the audience. It's not been so long since I was in law school that I'm not somewhat awed at the notion of being able to respond to Judge Posner. The second thing is, what a wonderful thing it is to be with this group. I can remember when the only such a gathering that I would be invited to in this kind of hallway would be, in this hotel actually, was the Federalist Society. And the balance of the panel was a little different. And then finally, I have to say that, and I'm surprised some of the other panelists haven't said this, I'm not speaking for the oversight panel. I'm required to say that. I'm just speaking for me and the AFL-CIO. John, the funny thing about your question is that I both like and admire Hank Paulson. That may be an unpopular thing to say, but I had a fair amount of dealings with him, and I think that he served his country well in a very trying moment, and is underappreciated for that. That being said, I think that a lot of people have commented that there is some continuity in policy, particularly around not so much regulatory policy, but the nature of the way in which the banking crisis was managed. between the Bush administration or the Paulson administration and the Obama administration. I think there's a big difference in regulatory policy, huge. I think that Secretary Paulson learned in a very painful way how misguided his initial stance was that it was not necessary to regulate the shadow financial markets, hedge funds, non-bank banks, and the like. And so I think he was a very different person around those issues when he left office. The Obama administration came in with just a fundamentally different posture, and I think it was best articulated by the president in his speech at Cooper Union during the campaign, where he said, we must have a regulatory system that regulates financial activity and financial institutions for what they really are economically, and not for what lawyers are able to label them. No offense to any of us who might be lawyers. It's been a long, complex, and torturous process, but I think that spirit animates both the administration's white paper on financial reform that kicked off the process, and it animates the bill that is, making its painful way through the conference committee today. You referred, John, to the notion that I or other members of the oversight panel or some other people in Washington might feel that things weren't moving fast enough. Right? And I think there's a really fundamental issue underlying that, and it's not just in financial regulation, but it's more broad. It's a more broad issue, and it's the one you identified in your introduction when you talked about offense and defense. There are voices within, I would say, within the larger policy community in Washington, within the administration, that fundamentally see regulatory processes as a matter of defense, meaning that we just don't want to have any disasters. Right? So that would sort of, the cry for macroprudential regulation, I think, is in the financial sector, which is the idea that somebody should be watching everybody. Not a bad idea at all, in my opinion, but it's a fundamentally defensive idea. The notion that we ought to, for example, in finance, the idea that we ought to basically give regulators wide discretion, say around capital requirements, and make sure that then there are adequate capital requirements so that whatever anybody's doing, it won't necessarily blow up and take the system down. That's defense. What's offense? I think offense is the idea that, and here may be where the difference is, the offense is the notion that there are fundamental policy objectives to be achieved through regulation that involve addressing ways in which our society is headed in the wrong direction and making sure that we head in the right direction. Now, regulation is, I think, regulation understood precisely, meaning APA, acts taken by the administration on the Administrative Procedures Act. That's kind of a small tool for a big task, right? And when you talk about offense for real, you really are talking about legislation, regulation, and presidential leadership together. And what does that mean? Let's look at the spill in the Gulf. One way of approaching the spill in the Gulf is to say, well, under the Bush administration, or for that matter, in Judge Posner's terms, on a bipartisan basis for a long time, we allowed the regulatory apparatus that watches offshore oil drilling to deteriorate and to become captured. So let's do something about that. Let's pay those people higher salaries. Let's figure out ways of tapping. If we grant, by the way, that government can't tap expertise, let's figure out ways of tapping private sector expertise. By the way, I don't grant that at all. I note, for example, that we don't seem to have any problem getting expertise in the military at a very high technological level, and figuring out how to have the military drive the civilian expertise that we bring in behind it. But so let's think about that set of moves, right? That's defense. What's the goal? The goal is to make sure that as we drill our way through the deep seabed, that we don't completely destroy all of our economy in the process. What would offense be? I think the president hinted at offense 2 nights ago. Offense would be saying, this is completely crazy. This notion that we are going to power our economy by finding the last drop of oil at the bottom of the deepest marine trench. And, you know, as Al Gore once said in an event I was at, look for energy sources that are the equivalent of a heroin junkie shooting up his toes. The idea that we're not going to do that. We're going to move toward a truly sustainable energy policy, one that is compatible with not having 5 degrees Celsius changes in our climate. That would be offense. In the financial sector, I think offense would be saying something I think offense has 2 dimensions to it. One is taking really a hard look at whether or not we have a healthy banking system in the most conventional sense. And the continued problems with credit provision in the private sector suggest to me at least that we still don't. And then taking those actions, and then really moving from triage and band-aiding to actually cleaning up balance sheets. But in a way, the real kind of offense is to ask ourselves, is our financial sector moving its savings to investment? There's a difference between those 2 things. Is it really doing that? And is it moving savings to investment in ways that address societal needs? Now, societal needs, I don't mean by that some kind of mushy great society notion of, is Goldman Sachs handing out money to the poor? That's not what I mean. What I mean is, are we solving the great economic problems, broadly understood? Is private capital moving to solve those problems? Right? One could look at something like energy and say that the answer seems to be no, right? And that we've got decades of the answer being no. One could also look at other aspects of our society and raise that question as well, and the answer would appear to be no. Offense might be trying to do something about that. This push and pull here between defense and offense, I think, is the fundamental issue. I'm going to stop there, but I cannot resist saying one thing. Judge Posner talked about the Europeans and how the Europeans don't know how to do this any better than we do. At least with respect to some of the things I just mentioned, I believe that Denmark is going to be completely carbon neutral in the way that it generates its energy within, I think, a 5-year period. That seems to me like doing better than we do. And I would observe that in relation to economic growth, where the judge, of course, is right about the relative scale of recovery. Fascinating fact. Where's the fastest economic recovery coming in the world's major economies? China, no question. Where's the second fastest? The United States. Where's the slowest? Europe. What maps that pattern? Intensity of stimulus. The Chinese had by far the biggest stimulus package in relation to their economy. We had an underpowered one, but we had one. Because the Europeans don't have a fiscal policy, and because the German government decided that stimulus was a bad idea, the European economy simply didn't have one of any significance. And perhaps that's a coincidence. It's not a big enough sample size to be statistically significant, but it's the only one we've got. Thanks.
I'm going to come back to Richard on the question of whether this was foreseeable, because Judge Posner argued that it was not foreseeable by either the Americans or the Europeans. But Lois, I want to get you into the conversation, and particularly on this offense-defense point. David Sanger has a piece in the New York Times this morning suggesting that the administration might be accused of overreach in its reaching into specific companies, and cites BP and setting up the fund, the $20 billion fund that they agreed to on Wednesday, intervention with GM, intervention in specific financial institutions. I think on the regulatory side, one of the things that's frustrated the administration has been the inability of the Congress to move forward with a climate control legislation, a comprehensive energy and climate bill. Still at it this summer. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But in the meantime, the administration's moved pretty aggressively to use existing authority under the Clean Air Act to begin the process of regulating CO2 as a pollutant under the Act. And is there the capacity in that context for both? How would you assess the capacity for playing offense? That is, taking on a fundamental challenge when the political system seems incapable of doing so, and what are the dangers of doing that in a way that doesn't have political consensus on Capitol Hill. You've been at this for a good long time in a couple of administrations.
All right. Well, first of all, I'm happy to be here. I'm particularly delighted there are law students in the audience hearing about regulation being a good thing. You probably haven't lived much of your life knowing that. We have the opportunity. I have the usual disclaimers. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for NOAA. And then I'm going to take a lesson from Judge Posner and use your excellent question to talk about what I want to talk about.
Fair point.
So I will say that I think regulation is indeed, in many ways, affirmative. And while we sort of sometimes cower and say, oh, my goodness, if we are vigorous enforcers here, Congress will be mad at us, that in fact, both in the Clinton administration and certainly the Obama administration, it's fair to say that in the environment area where I work, not to put too fine a point on it, the green badge cops are back on the beat. And it is, I think, affirmative and carries forward an affirmative agenda in the environmental area in the sense that clean air and clean water really is redistributive. That is, it helps everyone, including less well-off people as well as well-off people, and that's one of the ways that we can look at effective regulation. Tino, I would add to the idea of strong and effective, simple, practical, fair regulation, something to be aspired to, but in the meantime we have complex and still need to use it. The fact that there has to be strong and effective enforcement as part of it. Having good rules without enforcement is tantamount to having no rules at all. I would like to blend into the conversation before I get to my sort of upbeat prescriptions, the fact that we're very focused on the financial crisis and the oil spill crisis, and they are important crises. But for those of you who actually know me, I backlog newspapers, and then every once in a while I read through them. And I did that on Memorial Day, and there were 6 or 7 crises. We've forgotten the Massey mine disaster. That was probably a preventable disaster. 29 deaths is pretty serious. That was a company and a set where it was not the first mine disaster for recent times. There was a huge Toyota recall, maybe not quite as serious, but certainly the regulatory agency said we didn't have effective tools to do anything about it. Our own metro subway that we all love in Washington has had hard times, and some of that has been seen as a failure of regulation. There was a headline about prescription drugs. When profit outweighs penalties, pharmaceutical giants Pfizer and Lilly can spend $1 billion developing a new pill to recoup their investment. They want doctors to prescribe their drugs for uses not approved by the FDA. The illegal practice costs them billions in fines with vast sums at stake. It's simply the cost of doing business. So we have broad regulatory issues in addition to the financial failure and the BP spill that I think that we have to look at and address. To me and what I have seen, I think that the idea that we have orderly regulation effectively enforced is a way to get at it. Will we stop everything? No, but we certainly can take a big step in the direction of doing it. And we have some examples of success, and I think that's why, as we look at the Obama administration using air regulation affirmatively, we can look at some of those successes. For example, we started with the Cuyahoga River burning in Ohio. Our rivers are cleaner. They're not clean by any stretch, but they certainly are a whole lot cleaner than they were in the early 1970s when we started down the path of more effective regulation implemented for clean water. Our air is cleaner too. I mean, greenhouse gas is a serious problem, but it is also fair to say that if you live in Los Angeles now, you can actually see, and in many of our cities, the air is a great deal cleaner than it was in the 1970s when we started down this path. I think it's important to talk about those regulatory successes. I'm now working on fisheries enforcement because that's one of the things NOAA does in addition to dealing with the spill. And that's an area where I would say we are making some progress, though we're on the edge. It's a complicated, very complicated regulatory scheme and a lot of pushback, including from the regulated community. And I think we have to do a better job of explaining that the goal here is to have fish not just for this year and next, but going into the future. So what are some of my thoughts about it? First, I'm not a sports metaphor person, but when John Wooden died, I realized he had great quotes. So things turn out the best for people who make the best of the way things turn out. I really think that hopefully we can take the series of disasters we have now, the financial disasters that my colleagues have talked about, the BP spill, the Massey mine disaster, and really use this as a touchstone to turn forward for having effective regulation effectively enforced. But I think to do it, and this is a particular message to the law students in this audience, first we have to make the case for government. And I think that just as last night Senator Franken said, it's hard to say Senator Franken, right? Senator Franken made a very substantive and eloquent talk about how the Federalist Society has framed the debate in terms of originalism, and we just have to leave that behind. I think similarly, we have to leave behind this idea that it's about big government or small government. It's about effective government, and the government serves a really important role. Government is us, and there are things government can do, including collective action, backup action, big action, expertise action, that only the government can do, and I mean government at the federal, state, and local level. I don't mean just the federal government. And that we have to start making the case for that in a way that people understand. I think sort of the paradigm problem is the phrase we heard throughout the health debate, get your government hands off my Medicare. I mean, we failed if that's what people are saying, and that's what people are saying. So we really have to make the case for why government matters and government is us, and government can do things other people can't do. And acting collectively. We have to educate for citizenship, and this is, I think John really goes to the question of you use regulation in an affirmative way, and does it serve? The numbers are staggering, and the one I mostly cite is the American Bar Association did a poll in 2005 and found that only 45% of Americans, only 55% of Americans, slightly over half, could identify correctly the three branches of government. That's pretty basic. A lot of people thought it was the Republican, Democrat, and independent branches, and others thought it was the local, state, and federal branches. If that's where we are, we have a huge job to go to get people to think about it. And finally, I think that we have to state the case to get over this list of woes, that there's sort of a core of what is an effective regulatory system and an effective enforcement system. It has to have adequate resources. People aren't going to be liked and being enforced against, but we have to stand behind the idea that that's going to happen so that we don't have more BP oil spills. And this is true for all three branches of government.
I want to, Richard, you're the only person who actually has to run and get elected and convince people that I guess what Lois is saying is either true. And I'd like maybe you to react to that. Do you go out and try to defend the role of government in running for office in Ohio, or what's your message to the people about the role of your office in effectuating or affecting their lives?
We do, and yet I talk a lot about making government more effective, including my own office and those I work with. I think it's important for those in government to frankly acknowledge that government hasn't worked very well in a lot of respects, and there's much reform, much greater efficiency that can be achieved, but also a better understanding of our purposes and objectives and how to get there. I wanted to react to some of what Judge Posner said. Very enjoyable remarks. I think now that I'm no longer in the classroom and he can't call on me, it makes it more enjoyable. Only John seems to have that power on this panel. It is the case that the kind of issues we're talking about, I want to focus on the financial system, are so complex that it is difficult to foresee and to expect the magnitude of the things that have happened here. Nonetheless, there were tremendous warning signs, particularly at the local level. When I was the Franklin County Treasurer in the first part of the last decade, and we began to see tremendous pathologies in the real estate market, the housing market, things that we couldn't understand, mass delinquencies that were a window onto flipping schemes and the like. These sorts of things were so distant, so far removed from both the government regulators in Washington and from the top layers of the banking bureaucracy in New York and elsewhere, that I think that they were just totally misunderstood or ignored or pushed aside. People didn't want to believe that there were significant cracks opening up in a system that on the surface seemed to be going relatively well. The stock market was high, profits were high, everything seemed great. A big part of the problem was that the regulatory structure that was in place was effectively on the ground dismantled in the sense that it wasn't legislatively overruled, but it was not being enforced. There wasn't a lot of belief that it mattered. An SEC that had no inkling that Bernie Madoff was doing what he was doing, despite the warnings they had, was a body that was absolutely ineffective and not on the job. At the same time, I think there are warning signs now that we need to pay attention to, which are that this financial crisis is far from over in real terms. And that's not only because unemployment is still very high, but if you look at the in my mind, effective cause at the community level of the financial crisis, which was the foreclosure crisis, the bad lending in the mortgage market that led to disastrous, unprecedented volumes. In Ohio, in the mid-'90s, we had approximately 15 to 20,000 foreclosures being filed each year. A certain amount of dislocation in the economy, healthcare problems, people losing jobs, death in the family, kind of things that upset people's apple carts. Over the last year, we had 89,000 foreclosures filed last year, 85,000 filed the year before that, 83,000 filed the year before that. We're going to have more than 90,000 filed this year. There are millions and millions of residences and commercial properties on the bank's books that they just don't have any idea or capacity what to do with. They are denying these things on their books. They are putting them into foreclosure, letting that process grind on. If they do end up having ownership, they deny the ownership, they don't register the deeds. There's just still a tremendous amount of dislocation. We have, in effect, a Great Depression with the social safety net unfolding right now, and this will take, more like 10 years for us to work through and get back to health. And I don't know how many years it will take or how many quarters it will take of virtually zero interest rates for the banking books to get back in order to absorb the massive fallout of what we have seen. But in terms of how government works, at the Attorney General level, we feel very strongly that we have a very significant role to play that the federal government can't play, that the local government can't play, which is that most of the middle-class America, most of the people who are average working families, they have very little access, meaningful access to the legal system. They do not have in the family budget to hire lawyers. If they have a problem, if they're mistreated, they typically will complain about it a bit and see if someone does something about it and then swallow it and move on. We feel strongly that we in the Attorney General's office for consumers and in other respects, we in effect are the lawyers for the middle class, and we need to be the ones who stand up for them and enforce fairness, broadly speaking, across the broader economic activity that most people engage in, which is consumer transactions. We're getting increasing amounts of help from the federal government. If the new consumer agency comes into play, we believe we'll have a collaborative relationship with them. That's a very important thing for us. It doesn't speak to the broader levels of the catastrophic things we've seen, the financial meltdown, the economic problems in the Gulf. But these are things that matter to people every day in their lives.
What's the role of criminal enforcement? There's been relatively little of it at the federal level. What about it?
Criminal enforcement is important, but criminal enforcement almost by its nature, unless it's an active problem where you're taking people off the streets, violent crime is of that sort, is always an after-the-fact thing. There is a lot of criminal enforcement around the country right now on the issue of mortgage fraud. We had a press conference yesterday. U.S. attorneys' offices in Ohio and our office are collaborating, local authorities are collaborating. But that's mostly beside the point to real life now. The financial markets have crashed. Most of the bad lending and bad activity has been resolved because it's no longer saleable in the market. We're going after people who did wrong. We're going to put them in jail. But it isn't, that in itself sends a message. It's an important message, just as it's important for regulators now to show they're back on the beat. That's a deterrent for people. But it isn't really affecting much of what's going on in the financial markets right now.
Can I just pick up on that point? I want to just make 2 points about what Richard was saying, which I think is very important. Number one, on criminal enforcement specifically, I think it's important for us to remember that in an effort to get the public to understand the role of government, we have to try our best to understand the interconnections between different tools that we have in the public sector to try to provide the public with a clear sense that there's accountability and that people are being responsible for their actions. And some of this is about the right statutory rules, some of it's about the right regulatory rules, but some of it really is about making sure that the criminal laws we have on the book are enforced. So you'll notice that the Obama administration has very much focused on creating task forces to deal with healthcare fraud and financial fraud for two separate reasons. One is because you can make a case that for too long, these problems have not been effectively addressed. They are complex in some respects, and I'll mention in a second what I mean when I talk about simple. But second, this interchange, this interplay between regulators who do a lot of the information gathering, who try to figure out exactly where the systemic problems are, and prosecutors and investigators that work on individual cases is very important. It's important to get right, to create the right relationships. I think part of this is about leadership, but part of it also is about making sure we have the right statutory rules. And to go back for a moment to the terrible mining tragedy in West Virginia, I think we have to take a very hard look at all the different ways in which we can prevent these disasters. But it is a little hard to tell a story where prospectively, in terms of deterrence, all is well when the laws in question create basically a misdemeanor offense for a violation that leads to somebody's death sometimes. And that, you sort of have to wonder if we're at the right level there of society signaling, which is what we do with criminal liability, that this is serious business, that this matters, that this is about real lives and real people.
I would add to that for environmental, on the environmental front, having a strong criminal component of enforcement is a very important part of deterrence, as well as the fairness that you're outlining. And what I call the modern environmental enforcement package, but it's generalizable, would include strong criminal as well as civil and administrative and citizen suit enforcement. And I think that our laws are spotty across the board on that.
And if I could just add one more thing. Several of us have talked about complexity. I've talked about simple. Let me just explain what I mean by that, because there is nothing simple about a lot of the regulatory problems we face, and I don't want to be misunderstood. When I use the term simple, I mean two different things that are important in the discussion. Number one, when we're talking about whether tobacco companies should be able to sell candy-flavored cigarettes, when we're talking about whether truck drivers who are driving on interstates should be able to text while they drive, there is a simplicity sometimes to the answer to the question. I'm very happy to admit that we ought to do economic analyses to understand exactly what the costs there are, but I think that the underlying answer to the question is not that complicated. Number two, it's worth remembering that when we talk about the oil spill and financial regulation, sometimes the audience we're talking about is the private sector, but sometimes the audience is also consumers. So in as much as we're thinking about all these things that are happening in the background involving regulation to protect our public health and our environment, if we want those regulations to work, and this is part of what it means to make government effective, we have to think hard about this basic question. Are these regulations going to be understood? Is the public going to get what we are asking? Will they understand why protecting shell eggs from contamination is important to protect our families from getting sick from salmonella poisoning? Will they understand what it means when this financial product is being offered by a financial company? And I think it's incumbent upon us to work hard over time, recognizing the underlying regulatory complexity, that the more we're able to make simple rules that are capable of being understood by the mass public when that's the audience, the more effective we're going to be.
Damon?
I want to pick up on the bridge from the discussion we've just had about sort of enforcement issues, take back to Rich's point about that we're actually in a kind of modulated depression. The Obama administration is in, I think, the difficult spot of sort of living with the time lag on regulatory, on kind of the dismantling of the regulatory state by the Bush administration. That the Obama administration now has to deal with these things that didn't happen during the Bush administration, happened in the Obama administration, but are the results of the sort of gutting of our regulatory scheme at that time. It's you get into a conversation of how do we just make the basics of this system work? How do we make mine inspectors inspect mines? How do we make sure that we actually have the capacity to safely manage offshore drilling? These kinds of questions. But we're having that conversation at a time when the actual challenges, and this comes back to the offense-defense point, when the actual challenges our society faces are way more profound. Rich talked about all this property on the bank books. That's what I was alluding to when I said we haven't really fixed the banks. Right? That we've got, and not really fixing the banks, well, that sounds like kind of a small bore regulatory problem. It's not. It's a macroeconomic problem. We have 4 banks, all of which were in various stages of weakness, serious weakness, during the crisis. And today, we have 4 banks that represent 60% of our banking sector, roughly. Right? Those 4 banks, when those 4 banks hold all these bad assets, that means they're in a poor position to lend, and the data shows they're not doing it. When four banks with 60% of our banking assets are in a poor position to lend, that is a drag on our entire economy. At the same time, and this comes back, by the way, to Massey, right? At the same time, right, we've had a fundamentally mistaken notion of how our economy should work for a generation. Right? And the fundamentally mistaken notion is the idea that we can have an economy driven by consumer spending with low wages. Right? And if you think about it for a second, how would you square that? How would you square that contradiction? Exactly the way we did, through borrowing. Now, undoing that is a giant task. It is offense personified. And that brings us back to Massey. Now I'm going to show you that I actually do work for the AFL-CIO. There is no way to get enough inspectors into enough coal mine. And there's no way to have an inspector looking over the shoulder, right, of every supervisor in every coal mine to see they're doing what they're supposed to do. It cannot be done that way. The only way in which there is safety in a workplace like a coal mine, or for that matter on an oil rig, and I remind you that 12 workers died on that rig when that rig blew, right? The only way to do that is to have the folks who work there, who have an interest in not getting killed, have an ability to speak up. And it might have something to do with why all those people died at Massey, that the Massey Coal Company and its CEO have a record a mile long of violating their workers' rights in the workplace that in theory are protected by the law of the United States, but which in fact have no meaningful protection at all. All right, and that's the right to form a union and to speak out in your workplace, not just around wages and benefits, but around safety. If we're going to change the fundamental paradigm of our economy of being this fundamental dysfunctional paradigm of being low wage and try to be low wage and high consumption at the same time, or to put it another way, to be low wage and middle class at the same time, right, then we have to deal with those issues that are fundamentally, in a sense, issues of the regulatory state. Right? Is the government going to protect in a meaningful sense the ability of workers to act together to ensure that they get a fair share of the wealth they create, and thereby we have a high-wage, high-consumption society. We're also not going to be able to do this unless we deal with the problem of the banks that Rich was talking about. We can't get, as long as we have essentially fundamentally paralyzed banks, we are going to be constantly under threat of what we in the TARP oversight business call the Japan scenario.
I'm now beginning to paraphrase the question from the audience, but I think the judge both wanted to react to Damon. And you've written about, Judge, in that context, the fact that the system's kind of rigged towards procrastination, that taking on problems, particularly catastrophic consequences, is always easier for the next guy. So I wonder if you
Yes,
in your reflections whether you
right. Well, you know,
bring
that
point
worries
up, too.
me. I'd never heard this distinction between defensive and offensive regulation before. It bothers me because, you know, defense precedes offense. If you have all these disasters looming on the horizon, it seems to me if we could deal with them more effectively, we can. That should be the. And also, at least, I didn't like this suggestion that the global warming problem is something, you know, for offense. No, look, that's a disaster problem. That's as serious a looming disaster as our economic problem. It's not that global warming. It's not that over 100 years there'll be gradual rises in temperature eventually causing disaster, because over 100 years there'll be technological solutions. The danger is abrupt global warming, which could happen at any time. So this is one of these classic low probability, very high loss scenarios, and you want to have, you want to focus on preventing that disaster, so that the carbon taxes and other ways of dealing with global warming. Those should be urgent measures, not some sort of long-term things. I'm bothered by that. I'm also troubled by the suggestion we just heard about the problem is the 4 banks. The problem of this financial catastrophe, it's a problem of correlated risk. It doesn't matter whether you have 4 banks or 4,000 banks. If they all have the same business model and they're all interrelated and they're lending to each other and so on, then they all go down like a row of dominoes. So the size of the banks is not the critical thing. Complexity, yes, but it's the correlated risk. And in fact, everything can fall down. I find that troublesome. I do want to just make one brief remark about what Rich Cordray said about the importance of local information about looming disaster. Because when I did my first book on the financial crisis, I asked a research assistant, go to the web and type in housing bubble, and then see what was being said about housing bubble in the early 2000s. And it turns out that local newspapers are full of stuff about housing bubbles. They say there's a housing bubble in our community. What are you going to do when the housing bubble bursts? Somehow, all this information did not rise to the top government level. So you have 250 PhD economists in the Federal Reserve. They're not reading, local papers, Gulfport, Alabama, or something about housing prices there. So there's this obliviousness to the information you need. I think just information collection is a very neglected a part of regulation.
Were they oblivious, or did they merely think it was self-correcting? That the institutions themselves, that the complex financial, particularly the swaps, would self-correct whatever problem was occurring in the housing.
No, I think they actually. I think Greenspan and Bernanke, and it is interesting. The continuity is striking. Summers and Geithner and Bernanke, who remain the architects of our economic policy, they're the guys who screwed up, right? So it's extraordinary where you have the people who cause or contribute in a significant way to an extraordinary economic failure are then put in charge of repair. Now, they do know a lot. They're intelligent people. So, maybe, but it means there's no accountability, right, for mistakes of this sort. So, but no, they did not think it was a housing bubble. I mean, you observe, housing prices rising 10% a year. Why? You can imagine situations under which you would have a sharp, a huge population increase, or part of your housing stock had been wiped out by a meteor strike or something, but nothing was happening. But, Bernanke said 2005, housing prices. So then people, I'm not as enamored of the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, because I don't think there was fraud, obviously, it's always fraud. But I think people said, look, prices are rising, and that suggests that housing really is underpriced. Why are these prices going up? And the government tells us, well, it's fundamentals. They don't say what the fundamentals, they say, so it's a good investment. And Greenspan is saying, everybody should have an adjustable rate mortgage, right? You have a mortgage, down payment, maybe you don't pay interest for a couple of years, big reset rate in the 3rd year. But on the other hand, if housing prices are rising at 10% a year, after 2 years, if you bought a house with no net down payment, maybe you couldn't afford, you had no money for down payment, you've got 20% equity. So you can refinance with a standard 30-year mortgage. The government was telling people that's what you should do, right? And they do that. So, and if the government had thought there was a housing bubble, there was going to be a crash, and these people couldn't, refinance, and there'd be, an avalanche of defaults, they wouldn't have done this. But they didn't know. So, it's when you have these very intelligent people and all their PhDs and all that, and really not knowing what is going on in the economy or in an industry like deep sea oil drilling or with the climate problems, it does have to make you pessimistic about regulation. You know what? And so what I infer from that, I mean, and you know what Lois said is very important. The environmental regulation has been on the whole very successful, but I think and Mr. Quire is saying, if you want to talk about the text, I mean, this text of the truck drivers and so on, and the cigarette stuff. Yeah, you can deal effectively with that. It doesn't require great intellectual sophistication to deal with. So, but the very ambitious regulation, the notion that regulation can somehow lead the economy, or the suggestion that somehow regulation, administrative regulation, we do have a serious problem with growing inequality of wealth in the United States, and there is, and you know, the tremendous borrowing from abroad. These are very serious problems. They cannot be solved at the administrative level.
Which, from the question from the audience, follow up also, which is how much is this a question of industry capture of the agencies, or at least conventional wisdom coming from industries, in both these cases, in both the financial regulatory side as well as the oil disaster?
Well, I think of things like the mining disaster, the environmental disaster. There's a lot of capture, and it's extremely problematic. But I want to go back to the financial industry and a couple of points that the judge had made. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about greed on Wall Street and how that affects things. And I also want to talk about the problem of the disconnect of information from the local level to the
greed,
to the highest levels. Greed.
Greed.
Yes. First of all, the disconnect of local information to the national economy is a significant problem. And that goes back to how do we set up incentive structures that try to minimize that. There was a day and age not too long ago when mortgage lending was a local activity, and therefore it was centered on people, community banks, savings and loans, and others who were in that community. They knew that community. They would not have given some crazy loan to people in neighborhoods where they had a good sense of the neighborhoods and the like. What happened in the mortgage lending industry was the disconnect came with the secondary market and the securitization of loans, where all of a sudden people were making loans, and this was no longer the community bank savings and loans. It was brokered loans with money coming from Wall Street and elsewhere. But they were making loans where they had no responsibility for the long-term success of that loan. They didn't care. If they could make a loan on any terms and then sell it in the secondary market immediately, they were done, they were out, they had their fees. And so what I fault here is, I believe it's correct to say that in the private sector, people operate on greed. That's what drives the capitalist system. That's important. But the incentives need to be in place to cabin and channel the greed so that it doesn't have these broader externalities. And that system was entirely broken. The risk spreading that supposedly was happening in the financial system, where we find ultimately it wasn't really happening at all. Risk was quite large, and it was being concentrated, and a lot of things were being done to hide that risk, off balance sheets and the like. But I also would say it's easier for that disconnect to occur when there are 4 major banks with 60% of the market than when there are 4,000 banks, because they are so far removed to what's going on the ground and real loan underwriting and what it consists of, that it's much easier for that disconnect to become profound and them to feel that there's a new paradigm. You know, housing prices have gone way up. It's off the model from before, but it's just a different regime now. We've solved that. We've figured that out. We know how to leverage the risk. The other thing I want to say, so what I say about Wall Street greed is the greed in itself we can understand. Where I take offense is when it went not only to pushing the envelope and pushing it and finding nothing was pushing back and you could go quite a ways, but much of it went beyond. There was illegal activity. There was outright fraud. There was quite a bit of that. And we have rightly sued some of these national financial institutions, and we will pursue recovery. But the other thing is the short-term, long-term disconnect in terms of understanding people's self-interest is a profound one, and the regulatory system needs to understand that and find ways to respond to it. De Tocqueville talked about in America, one of the miracles of America he found was that there was self-interest. He called it self-interest rationally or properly understood. Meaning it wasn't the self-interest of what's in my interest this hour, this day, this week. It was planning and doing things for a year ahead, 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. We have lost that for the most part in our financial markets to our great sorrow. And so what's most remarkable about everything that happened on Wall Street and the financial system is how poorly The geniuses in the system actually understood the long-term interests of their financial institutions. But maybe they took the wrong lesson away that was the right lesson for them. You know, the rating agency's email where the fellow talked about the house of cards, it will come crashing down, but we'll be out of here and we'll be retired. Nobody has gone to jail in any of this crisis, rightly or wrongly. Very few of the executives involved have lost their massive profits from the crisis, and that is a problem, I think.
If I could just make one quick point on Judge Posner's comment on consumer financial protection, too. I think Judge Posner had some very interesting things to say, but I would push back slightly in the following sense. People get taken advantage of in two different ways. Some get defrauded. Others get hit with a contract that's 70,000 words long, extremely complicated even for the best lawyer to understand. And I think it's important to recognize that it's going to be very difficult to deal with the situation that got us into this financial mess if we don't deal with both problems.
You know, part of that problem is that regulation has required forms of disclosure to borrowers that are so elaborate that they're unbelievable. 2008, for some reason, our little local bank asked my wife and me, would we like to expand our home equity line of credit at 2%? Who could turn away? It's just a line of credit. You don't have to use it. So we went to the bank, and they handed us hundreds of pages of disclosure. And I didn't read them. I just signed it. I don't read all this stuff. Right?
That's a kind of consumer.
Wait till you get the
I rest my case.
David.
Judge Posner, I'm fairly, I hope that the Consumer Financial Protection Agency or Bureau, whatever it is, I'm sure they're ready and willing to take your case. Just two quick things. You know, first, I wanted to be, Judge, I think you misunderstood my point about the large banks. It was not that size alone was the determinant of the financial crisis. My point is that today, we have a variety of banks with some of which are strong and some of which are weak in our banking system. The four biggest banks all have, in my opinion, and I think this is the experience of Rich and his team who've looked at these things on a local level, all have very large books of toxic assets that cannot be valued today. The Congressional Oversight Panel tried to value them in August, in our August report, August 2009 report, simply couldn't put a number on them. Because of the concentration of our banking system in those relatively weak institutions, right, their weakness is a macroeconomic fact in two ways. If they're going to stay precariously afloat, they can't face up to the reality of their book of assets and write them down, which means we can't solve the foreclosure problem. That's macroeconomic problem one. That weighs on the housing sector. Macroeconomic problem two is they won't lend to business. So that as the economy revives, commercial credit becomes a constraint on the revival of the economy. Now, these two problems are fundamentally tied to the concentration in the system. They are not. It's not about what caused it. It's about the problem we face now. Now, the second thing I'm going to say very briefly, John, is you asked about sort of why didn't the regulators pick up on the problem? And I'll just tell you a little anecdote that to me defines what went wrong here. In the spring of 2007. I was at a meeting of the economic team of the OECD, the Organization of Developed Countries, which is a kind of it's a major sort of international level government-sponsored think tank, essentially. And we were talking about leverage in a different part of the economy, private equity and hedge funds. And there was a big meeting the OECD put on. And in the public meeting, the OECD staff was extremely optimistic about the notion that leverage in the world economy was not a significant risk, largely because of the kind of notion that essentially derivatives had spread the risk out in such a way that it wasn't concentrated in any one place. When we had the private meeting, right, when the door was closed, and it was just the economists and not the political people, right, they gave in a different briefing. They gave an account of the state of the world's economy. And it was a very optimistic account. This is the spring of 2007. Very optimistic. Everything's just humming along. And then they said, oh, by the way, there's this one little thing that worries us. And I asked them, so what is that? And they said, compression of risk spreads. And for those of you who understand what that means, compression of risk spreads means it is possible now in the world economy to borrow money for frankly nothing to do very risky things. Subprime loans, leveraged buyouts, you pick the risky thing. What they were basically saying, everything's going great, but the world's economy is about to blow up. Now, why? They knew that. They knew what the problem was. Right? And they had an explanation for it, to do with imbalance of trade flows, the way in which trade surpluses being accumulated in Asian exporting countries and energy-producing countries were being reinvested in global dollar-denominated credit markets. They understood all this. They just couldn't say it in public. Right? And I think that if you go around and interview people who were where the data was, at the key agencies, at the Fed, at the SEC, and the like, at the housing agencies, I think you'll find a lot of people knew. I think there were political constraints on acting. And that's, the regulatory system only works when there is the political power behind it to make it work, and the political will. And in part that represents, political leadership, and that's why we're talking about the age of Obama, but in part it represents us.
We've got a bunch of questions from the audience about the structure of regulatory policy making. We haven't really talked much about that. A few years ago, if you had this discussion, it would be all about OIRA, if they have too much power, too little power. But maybe I'll pose this to you, Lois, which is, to what degree has the Obama administration adopted Cass Sunstein's libertarian paternalism in writing regulations? Do you see the effect of Brother Sunstein on decision-making in the agencies?
Maybe I'm too remote from it, but I would say basically no. It is. We're writing regulations. We're writing regulations under, a set of sort of complicated rules and constraints. Every regulation has a long list of Regulatory Flexibility Act, National Environmental Policy Act. I actually like that act, but a series of analysis that has to be done to do it. It is something of an obstacle course to get a regulation written, but I certainly think that you can get a regulation written in this administration, that's quite important. But I do think, and this is sort of picking up on what was just said here, that there still needs to be a sense of political will in the face of what continue to be criticisms of regulation, that regulation is really important and making it work is really important. And I think that even though you may not be able to get a simple regulation the public can understand completely, that we can talk about it in terms of this might be off in the details in Greek letters, but really what it means is they have to reduce the amount of pollution they put into the water, and I think we can talk about that. But I would say that on the fish regulation side, which is the bulk of regulations that come through my office, we have not seen great difficulty. There are steps that have to be taken, but we haven't seen great difficulty.
One of the things that I think has surprised people, it's reflected in some of the questions, is that there was anticipation that there'd be more change in the basic structure, and yet OIRA is still back to a kind of line-by-line, major rule by major rule review of the regulatory scheme rather than looking at system regulation. Tino, I believe they're operating under the Clinton executive order again. They repealed the political commissar feature of the Bush executive order. But basically, they're kind of back to the future in terms of the basic structure, the way regulations are handled at administrative level. Why is that?
And I think in these issues, really, it represents the complexity of balancing two goals, which is what the folks over at OIRA do when they work with the agencies and other folks in the Executive Office of the President. On the one hand, it's respecting science, making sure that we have the most technically accurate information we can. On the other hand, recognizing that Article 2 of the Constitution is to some degree about accountability. It's about the President being in charge and making sure the laws are faithfully executed. And that can mean several different things, but it certainly means listening to the public. It means thinking about how a particular regulatory rule fits into the larger context. So a lot of that is happening, I would say, and it's important to look at that beyond simply the the words in the executive order, which is a different way of saying that if you look at Executive Order 12866, it really is a framework, like the Constitution, not in the sense of how important it is, but in the sense that it leaves room for people to apply it in a way that is responsible and effective. And then the last point I would make is that all these issues of regulatory structure, to get to a point that was made earlier, are important. They do determine how quickly regulation gets implemented, how much analysis gets done, but you also have to put it in the context of the administration's broader policy agenda, which is often reflected in its legislative priorities, which start off as statutes and then eventually involve implementation. And to see that agenda, you have to look at the FDA tobacco bill. You have to look at what we've been trying to do with the Affordable Care Act. You have to look at financial regulatory reform as well.
So Glenn Beck's concerns that Cass is the second most dangerous man in America are ill-placed.
I think a lot of those concerns are ill-placed, even beyond Cass Sunstein.
Judge, you want to defend your former colleague?
I would say just briefly on that front, I was giving a talk to some folks in the Central Valley of California some months back, and I turned on the radio, and the idea came from the radio station that, in fact, my colleague was the most dangerous or second most dangerous man in America.
I think they reserve most dangerous for the president.
But what really struck me there, and this is just a point I want to underscore, is how much of these debates really get down to the question of when you have a democracy of over 300 million people and you have really complicated issues, but the goal of trying to make it simple and understandable to people, how do you do that? How do you constantly engage in that conversation?
I will add, though, which is not at the core of the regulatory structure question, but certainly colors it, is we all have to make the case that regulation matters and regulation is effective. And what you're characterizing as offensive, that is that it can carry through an agenda of getting the air and water clean, fixing the financial institutions, preventing oil spills, helping to restore the Gulf Coast. We have to really be making that case effectively, and when I say we, I mean all of us.
There's a number of questions also, given the panel's focus on enforcement, about why not more is being said about civil litigation. And is that the appropriate realm, or are we left to rely on inspectors and government employees to go up and in essence, correct and enforce when people have violated regulations?
Civil litigation is really important, and as I said, a modern enforcement package includes citizen suits. And I think that any regulatory system should include citizen suits so that citizens have the capacity to go to court and say, here's a problem, these people are breaking the law, we need to do it needs to be addressed. That said, I think it bears broader discussion of what's happening with access to the courts, and that's a good topic for beyond the scope of this panel, but for the American Constitution Society to take on, because if civil litigation is used as an important tool to keep pushing the government and to get, and as an enforcement tool as well, we have to let people get to court to do it.
Rich?
I think regulation by litigation is not by any means the optimal model. However, sometimes it's about the only tool we have available to us. We use it aggressively in the Attorney General's offices around the country. We've been using it on mortgage fraud. We've been using it on the foreclosure issues. We're after the mortgage servicers, who are one of the baleful influences and really dysfunctional elements in this system right now as we go forward. But if you can find ways, and I agree it's difficult to do, and it's difficult as the problems are more complex, to channel the incentives in the right paths, if you can do that, rather than having to litigate after the fact as a way to clean things up, it's much to be preferred. But sometimes and often it's what we have, and it's what we use.
I mentioned the health care bill that just passed. In that case, we have litigation before the fact, which is that
Right.
there are a series of suits now challenging the constitutionality, particularly of the individual mandate under the Constitution. Does anybody want to opine about the federal government's ability to extend its reach into that arena? I don't know.
Well, I have opined. I think the lawsuit is poorly conceived and would require tearing up decades of settled precedent about the proper ability of the federal government to address national economic problems. So I can reiterate what I've said elsewhere, but that's my view.
David, you guys weighed in?
I'll make a sort of broader point. I was recently in Brussels at a conversation about the problems that Europe has as a result of having a sort of incomplete federal system. And, you know, it made me feel very good to be able to, as an American, to be able to say, you know, some of these issues we've actually solved in the United States. We're not really worried too much about the notion that we're going to disintegrate fiscally, meaning different pieces of our country are going to float off in different directions. The resurrecting the legal issues associated with the Lochner era, which is essentially where the healthcare litigation is going, reopening the question of whether or not the federal government has the legal powers to make economic reform, raises the threat from a very different direction of our federal system being unable to respond to the very pressing economic and sort of existential needs. I refer to Judge Posner's concern about global warming, that we disarm ourselves as a nation in the way that the Europeans at the moment seem to find themselves disarmed. That would be an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. I don't think that litigation will succeed, but I think we ought to understand what the stakes in it are.
Lois? Comment?
The only other thing I would add to that is, and of course I would share your legal view.
Maybe you'll
about
answer
the-
my earlier question
the
about the endangerment finding.
Oh, well, we'll come back to that in a minute. Let me just make this one other thing. It's such an excellent question. Is that the idea that many state attorneys general think that there's political merit, if not legal merit, in bringing those cases, I think says a lot about the climb that we have to make to get back to people understanding what the government can do and why there's an important role to be played. Because ultimately it's not a legal motivation for those cases. I think anyone sort of looking can see. And how is it that this many people in this many states think this is a politically smart move is a little scary.
There's a question which I think raises the issue about governmental capacity, particularly in the BP context, which is how should our country walk the fine line between holding private industry accountable for its actions in the context of regulatory disasters and ensuring that there's a coordinated, responsible response to the disaster. Should BP have as much say, I think, is the import of this question in actually reacting to the disaster.
One thing I'd like to make clear, that is what the law is now. I mean, we have a regulation, it's called the National Contingency Plan, issued, you know, with the way regulations are issued under the Oil Pollution Act, and it specifies that the responsible party has an active role. So we can reconsider that. You know, I think that the general thinking is that company both has financial responsibility and should have, not that company, there's more than one responsible party here, we have to keep reminding ourselves, but has a financial role, but also may have technical expertise to bring to bear. But it may, I think, one of the fallouts of this may well be that we take a look at that approach that we've taken. But I think that the sort of implicit suggestion that somehow this was gratuitous to bring in BP doesn't take account of the fact that this is the way that the rules are currently written.
NOAA came in for some criticism early on for not having the scientific expertise to determine what was actually happening, particularly under the water, the oil plumes, et cetera.
Yeah, well, NOAA has a lot of scientific expertise about what's going on in the ocean, and we don't have all perfect scientific expertise about what's going on at depth and what happens when there's a spill at depth. And to me, and this is not speaking as NOAA, this is speaking for myself, that may be appropriate to build into a precautionary principle of do we allow oil drilling to go forward, and what kind of backup controls do we require before we let it go forward in a circumstance where we don't have complete or effective scientific information. That's one piece. And the second piece is I think this is a huge cry for being sure that we develop prospectively effective science, that we make the investment that it takes in having scientific research so that we know we have that kind of information developed and available as activity happens.
Tino, does the White House feel like, I know you're not a frontline person on the spill itself, but does the White House feel like it has inside the government the capacity to at least make the scientific judgments about what's going on at this point?
John, it's a two-track problem. On the one hand, there's an ever-present crisis to deal with immediately, and I think on that front, the feeling is that the resources necessary for a day-to-day response are there, but the second track, which is just as important, and really I think gets to one of the core things that have been that's been mentioned during this discussion in different ways, is the idea that even while we're dealing with this crisis in the short term and sparing no expense and making absolutely every effort and burning the candle at both ends, there's this question of what is going to happen tomorrow and what is going to happen in 50 years. And I think on that front, the real issue is going to have to be taking a harder look, the way Judge Posner was alluding to in some respects, at the capacity of agencies to manage problems, because you're dealing not only with what we learn from this crisis, you're also dealing with expectations of the public that change. And I just want to make one point about that in a different context to illustrate the idea. 60 years ago, we were in a much less good position to prevent foodborne illness from happening in this country. We've had tremendous improvement over the course of 60 years. We have not had enough improvement. 6,000 people a year still die. Millions of Americans get sick. And part of what we've realized is that as public expectations have changed and as the public has demanded higher standards in terms of food safety, we're also in a better position to deliver higher standards because technology has changed. So part of being an effective leader, I think, is recognizing that that's the challenge. It's dynamic. It's not just meeting this particular challenge, but evolving to do the best we can for the American people.
Judge, let me pose the last question to you, which is, can you imagine the capacity inside the government to be able to actually assess these long-term risks and create some kind of sensible budgeting against which you apply the resources of the government to manage these big risks that are out in the future?
Well, the only thing I can really think of would be an improvement in information gathering within the government. I learned that recently, I heard from Lois, that FEMA, for example, regards itself as simply concerned with cleaning up or dealing with emergencies after they occur rather than with prevention. So there doesn't seem to be a high-level, presidential level agency that's concerned with assessing risks across the whole range of dangers. And I think there would be value there. Collecting information, trying to measure the different risks, trying to rank them in some way, and directing attention to them. The problem is it's extremely difficult to get Americans worried about low probability events because there's so much high probability problems to worry about in the near term. So I'm not terribly optimistic. After all, we have a whole civilization's history of being surprised, surprise attacks, disasters. It's unlikely to change, but anything we can do at least to learn more about these. And so I've been surprised in the global warming discussions that there really has been very little discussion of the risk of abrupt global warming. Some large chunk of ice that falls off the Antarctica could raise global ocean levels by 6 feet. That would be an absolute catastrophe. So people have to be made aware of these in order for there to be any political pressure for reform. I had a meeting some years ago with President Bush's science advisor, a physicist, perfectly respectable person. And I asked him whether he agreed with me that the possibility of asteroid collisions with the Earth was something that was worthy of concern, that we should be mapping. There are actually 300,000 asteroids whose orbits intersect the Earth's orbit. and many of those, if they hit us, would cause absolute catastrophe, could extinguish the whole human race and the other races as well. And he said yes. He agreed it was a problem, and it would be very good for NASA to accelerate its program of mapping these near-Earth objects, so that because if actually an asteroid was likely actually to hit the Earth, provided with some years in advance, would be possible to deflect its orbit relatively simply. But he said people aren't worried about asteroid collisions. They've seen Armageddon. They realize if an asteroid is about to hit, you send a group of Americans up there with an atomic bomb. They blow it in half. Both halves miss the Earth. He said you can't get them worried. You can't get NASA to get excited about asteroids because NASA believes that its future is entirely bound up with manned space flight. That's the only thing people care about. And if they don't have manned space flight, they won't have their $11 billion budget. So they refuse to be deflected into worrying about asteroids. And if you speak to astronomers, we had an astronomer at the University of Chicago who has a big grant for a telescope, and I learned that this telescope would be ideal, actually, for mapping these near-Earth objects. He says, no, astronomers are not interested in asteroids. They're too close. They're dull. And the Air Force, absolutely, Air Force doesn't like to do any civilian tasks. So, you have real dangers that can be dealt with, but actually mobilizing public interest and political support for preventive measures is just extraordinarily difficult. So I'm pessimistic about it. It's not a good note on which to end.
I'm going to close on the one notion that I'm certain of, which is we will not be able to write a regulation that will prevent the asteroid from hitting the Earth. Please join me in thanking the panel.